The Templars built a secret education system that rivaled any modern war college. For centuries, the true origins of their training grounds have been obscured by myth and legend. This narrative uncovers how these elite warrior monks were forged inside sophisticated medieval strategy schools, institutions that were far more than simple fighting pits. You will gain a completely new understanding of knightly power by the end of this exploration. We will investigate why their schools were centers of intellectual thought and spiritual discipline, and how a quiet monastic library could become a nerve center for military planning. What single aspect of their training do you believe was most crucial to their legendary success? The early 12th century in the Holy Land was a world forged in conflict and faith. Pilgrims traveled treacherous roads, vulnerable to bandits and rival factions, creating a desperate need for protection. From this volatile landscape, the Templar Knight was born, a figure that defied easy categorization. He was both a man of the cloth and a man of the sword, living by a sacred vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience while mastering the brutal art of warfare. This was the core paradox of the Templar identity, a fusion of two worlds that had long been kept separate. How could one person devoutly pray for peace in the morning and expertly wield a sword in the afternoon? This very contradiction made their existence so revolutionary. It was not enough for them to be merely good fighters or moderately devout monks. They had to excel at both with an unwavering intensity, and that impossible standard demanded an entirely new kind of education. Their training could not be just a military drill, nor could it be solely a spiritual retreat. It had to be a complete system that forged the mind, body, and spirit into a single, disciplined instrument. This profound duality is why their training grounds had to become something the world had never seen before. The quiet of the monastery provided the first and most crucial layer of their training. Long before a novice ever held a sword, he was given a set of rules that dictated his every waking moment. The Templar rule, heavily influenced by the strict traditions of the Cistercian monks, was a blueprint for total self-control. It was not a suggestion but a sacred law, a detailed script for how to live, pray, and even think. This rigid daily structure was the forge where individual will was systematically broken down and reshaped. A young man entering the order would find his old identity stripped away through a relentless cycle of prayer, manual labor, and study, all conducted in an atmosphere of enforced silence. This was not about punishment but about reprogramming. The constant repetition of psalms, the hours spent copying texts in the Scriptorium, and the physical toil in the gardens were all exercises in obedience. They taught a man to silence his own inner voice, his personal desires and fears, and to replace them with the single, unwavering voice of the order. This psychological conditioning created a mindset of absolute loyalty, where the collective purpose of the Templars became more important than any individual life. The humble monastic cell, often a small, bare room with only a cot and a kneeler, was in truth the first and most important classroom. Here, in the stillness, a man learned the virtues of humility and introspection. He learned to confront his own weaknesses without the distractions of the outside world. This deep, internal strength, forged in silence and discipline, became the unshakable foundation for everything that followed. A warrior trained this way did not fight for personal glory or wealth. He fought as an instrument of a higher purpose, his actions guided by a discipline that originated not on the training field, but in the quiet of the cloister. This spiritual core is what made the Templar more than just a skilled mercenary. It made him relentless. Beyond the monastery's silent walls, a second curriculum awaited the aspiring Templar, one drawn from the vibrant and often contradictory world of the medieval court. The chivalric code was far more than a set of romantic stories. It was a formal system of ethics and behavior, a vital part of their education. Texts like the Ordine de Chivalry served as their practical textbooks, breaking down the lofty ideals of knighthood into actionable daily lessons. Courage was not merely about bravery in battle, but about standing firm in negotiations. Justice meant protecting the weak from the powerful, a core duty for any knight sworn to guard pilgrims. Loyalty was the absolute commitment to one's brothers and the order itself, a bond stronger than any feudal oath. This education in virtue was meticulously designed to transform a skilled fighter into a recognized knight, a leader who could command respect on and off the battlefield. A Templar had to know how to conduct himself in a royal court as well as he could hold a line of defense. He learned courtly manners not for personal prestige, but to represent the power and dignity of his entire order during diplomatic missions. This ingrained sense of noble purpose is what fundamentally separated a Templar from a common mercenary. Both were warriors, but only one was bound by a sacred and chivalric duty that governed his every action. The ideals of the court were not just decoration, they were woven directly into the fabric of military command, creating a leader who was disciplined, principled, and unwavering. This fusion of spiritual obedience and chivalric honor produced a knight whose moral compass was as sharp as his sword. This careful cultivation of character required a physical space to match its ambition. The locations chosen for Templar commanderies were never accidental. Each site was a deliberate selection to forge the ultimate training environment. Across Europe and the Holy Land, from the formidable Paris Temple to the agricultural powerhouse of Cressing Commandery in England, the geography was their first and most fundamental instructor. These were not just buildings, they were meticulously designed crucibles for leadership. Isolation was a primary factor, placing these communities at a deliberate remove from the distractions and political intrigues of bustling towns. This physical separation enforced the order's spiritual focus and created a secure, self-contained world where their unique curriculum could flourish without outside interference. But this isolation was always balanced with strategic access. A reliable water source was non-negotiable, not just for sustenance but for training, turning rivers into natural moats and challenging obstacle courses. Vast tracts of forest provided the raw materials for construction and fuel, while also serving as the stage for complex survival drills and navigation exercises. Open plains became living maps for practicing large-scale cavalry maneuvers and troop formations, the land itself teaching lessons in terrain and tactics. Every feature of the landscape was co-opted into the educational mission. The very earth was shaped to serve their purpose, creating a self-sufficient ecosystem where a man could be broken down to his fundamentals and rebuilt as a Templar. This holistic approach transformed the land from a mere backdrop into an active participant in their training. How do you build a school for the perfect knight? You begin by finding a piece of the world and turning it into a classroom without walls. Every stone in a Templar commandery was laid with a dual purpose. The design of these sprawling complexes was a masterclass in intentional architecture, creating a physical environment that perfectly mirrored their training philosophy. A typical commandery was not a random collection of buildings but a carefully orchestrated sequence of spaces, each dedicated to a different facet of a knight's development. At its spiritual heart stood the church, a sanctuary for prayer and contemplation, often designed with a round nave to echo the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This architectural symbolism was a constant, silent reminder of their sacred mission in the Holy Land, reinforcing their purpose with every glance. Adjacent to the church was the chapter house, a solemn hall where the brothers gathered for administrative meetings and collective self-criticism. Here, in a space dedicated to order and discipline, they learned the art of governance and accountability. The cloister, a covered walkway surrounding a peaceful garden, served as the connective tissue between these spiritual centers and the more physical domains of the commandery. This was a space for reflective study and quiet conversation, where the lessons of the church could be mentally digested before a knight moved to his next duty. The transition from these quiet, contemplative areas to the bustling outer bailey was deliberate and profound. One moment a man was in silent prayer, the next he was in the heart of the commandery's industrial and martial life. The barracks were designed for austere living, reinforcing the vow of poverty with simple cots and minimal personal space, while the stables were palaces for the horses, reflecting the immense value placed on their cavalry. The training yards, often vast areas of packed earth, were the stages for relentless physical conditioning. The seamless flow from chapel to cloister to barracks to training yard was no accident. It was a daily, physical journey that trained a man to shift effortlessly between the mindset of a monk and the reflexes of a warrior. An archway was not just an archway, it was a threshold between two equally vital states of being. A courtyard was not merely an open space, it was a classroom without a roof. The entire complex functioned as a single, integrated machine, its very layout engineered to produce a specific type of human being, one who could find God in the silence of the chapel and then embody his will on the training field with unwavering focus. This seasoned instructor, often a grizzled knight in his 50s or 60s, held a title that commanded instant respect, Magister Militum, the master of soldiers. His authority was absolute, forged not in a classroom but across decades of brutal campaigning in the harsh landscapes of Outremer, the Crusader states. This man was a living library of warfare, a repository of knowledge that no manuscript could fully capture. He had felt the shock of a cavalry charge, endured the thirst of a desert siege, and witnessed the chaotic fog of battle firsthand. His lessons were not abstract theories, they were hard-won truths written in scars and memory. He taught a complete system of war, a curriculum that ranged from the intimate mechanics of a sword parry to the grand strategy of reading enemy terrain and the crucial, unglamorous logistics of managing a supply line. A Templar knight needed to understand how a change in the wind could affect arrow flight just as deeply as he needed to know how many days of grain were left in the wagons. The master's role was to fuse these disparate skills into a single, seamless instinct. His teaching method was brutally simple and profoundly effective, a cycle of demonstration, relentless repetition, and immediate correction. A novice would watch the master's fluid, economical movements, then attempt to replicate them for hours on end under a watchful, critical eye. A misplaced foot, a poorly angled shield, a moment of hesitation, each error was met with a sharp physical rebuke. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was a deliberate method of conditioning. The pain of a quick strike from a training baton was far preferable to the fatal cut of a Saracen saber, and the lesson was seared into muscle memory forever. The entire dynamic between the old master and the young novice was built upon this foundation of absolute authority and total submission. The student surrendered his ego, his pride, and his own limited understanding, trusting completely in the master's greater wisdom. This relationship was the crucible where raw potential was hammered into tempered skill. The master's watchful eye was indeed the student's first and most constant battlefield, a relentless presence that taught vigilance, humility, and the iron discipline required to survive. In this environment, every moment was a test, and the master was the final, unblinking judge. The novice's day began in the profound darkness long before sunrise, summoned to prayer by a single bell. This was Matins, the first of 8 daily prayer sessions that structured his life. In the cold chapel, by flickering candlelight, he and his brothers recited psalms, their voices a low chant that anchored the day in spiritual purpose. There was no time for drowsiness. The discipline began the moment his eyes opened. As the first light touched the sky, the community gathered for the next office of Lords, praising the coming day they had not yet seen. This was not a gentle awakening, but a deliberate immersion into a state of devotion and focus. From the chapel, they moved directly to the chapter house for a meeting that was part administration and part public confession. Here, the rule was read aloud, and each man was expected to confess his own faults from the previous day, no matter how small. A poorly cleaned weapon, a moment of unnecessary speech, a lapse in attention during drill, all were laid bare before the entire brotherhood. This ritual was a powerful engine for humility, systematically dismantling pride and reinforcing that every action, no matter how minor, was subject to the order's law. After this, the novice might have a brief period for private study or reading in the cloister, but this was not leisure. It was another form of training for the mind. He would then be assigned manual labor, perhaps working in the commandery's gardens, repairing a wall, or assisting in the stables. Every task, from copying a manuscript to mucking out a stall, was framed as a form of prayer through action, each one essential to the community's survival and his own development. The morning's physical labor seamlessly transitioned into the day's first sustained combat training. On the packed earth of the training yard, the air filled with the sounds of clashing wood and shouted commands, the novice would practice for hours. He drilled with the long sword, the shield, and practiced mounting his horse in full armor until the movements became as natural as breathing. The master watched everything, his corrections swift and exact. This was not about learning to fight, it was about forging the body itself into a reliable weapon. The midday prayer of Sext offered a brief respite, a moment to refocus the mind before the silent meal that followed. In the refectory, no one spoke. The only sounds were the scraping of bowls and the voice of a single brother reading from a holy text from a pulpit high on the wall. The novice ate simple, hearty food meant for sustenance, not pleasure, his attention directed inward or toward the lesson being read. This enforced silence during meals was a powerful tool. It prevented the formation of cliques and personal friendships that could challenge loyalty to the whole order, while also teaching the discipline of controlling one's own thoughts and desires. The afternoon was a mirror of the morning, a relentless rotation of prayer, specialized labor, and more training. This second training session often focused on more complex skills like group tactics, cavalry maneuvers on the open plains, or the meticulous care and maintenance of his gear. A Templar's life depended on the quality of his sword, the health of his horse, and the integrity of his mail, so cleaning, sharpening, and repair were sacred duties. As dusk settled, the pace shifted once more. The evening prayer of Vespers marked the day's gradual closing, followed by a lighter supper, and perhaps a tactical lecture from the Magister Militum in the chapter house. Using diagrams drawn in sand or on a slate, he would explain battlefield principles, the strengths and weaknesses of different enemy formations, or the geography of a distant region. This was where physical skill met intellectual strategy. The day ended as it began, in the chapel for Compline, the final office. The novice would kneel once more in the quiet darkness, examining his conscience, surrendering the day's efforts to God. Then, in the silence of the dormitory, he would sleep on a simple cot, his body exhausted but his mind still processing the day's relentless lessons. This was the metronome of transformation, a grueling, unvarying rhythm designed to break down a man's individual will and rebuild him as a single, disciplined component of a much larger machine. Every hour was a calculated lesson, and the entire day was the curriculum. The true mark of a Templar commander was not just his skill with a blade, but his ability to wield a quill. Within the quiet Scriptorium, a room illuminated by tall, narrow windows and the steady glow of candlelight, a very different kind of training took place. Here, the sounds of clashing steel were replaced by the soft scratching of pens and the gentle rustle of parchment. This was the heart of their academic curriculum, a rigorous intellectual program that equipped these warrior monks with the knowledge to manage a sprawling international empire. The first and most fundamental subject was Latin. Every brother, regardless of his noble or common birth, had to achieve a working understanding of this universal language of the church and state. It was the key that unlocked everything, from reading the sacred scriptures to deciphering crucial military dispatches sent from the other side of the Mediterranean. A misread word in an order could lead to a disastrous tactical error, so precision in language was a matter of life and death. Alongside Latin, they studied practical mathematics. This was not abstract philosophy, but the hard arithmetic of survival and power. A commander needed to calculate exactly how many sacks of grain were required to feed 500 men and their horses for a 3-month campaign. He had to understand geometry to oversee the construction of a new fortress wall or assess the structural integrity of a besieged castle. Their logistical genius, a hallmark of their success, was born in these quiet hours spent solving problems on a wax tablet. Geography was another cornerstone of their studies. Using crude but effective maps and the detailed travelogues of returning brothers, they learned the lay of a land most had never seen. They memorized the locations of mountain passes in Anatolia, the locations of reliable oases in the arid Holy Land, and the treacherous currents of coastal waterways. This knowledge transformed a blank space on a parchment into a 3-dimensional battlefield, allowing a commander to plan marches, anticipate enemy movements, and secure supply lines with a strategist's eye. Finally, they were schooled in the basics of law and administration. The Templars were not just a military force, they were one of the largest landowners in Europe, managing a complex network of farms, mills, and ports. A knight might be required to adjudicate a land dispute between 2 local farmers one day and draft a legally binding trade agreement for wool exports the next. The ability to read a financial ledger and understand contractual obligations was as crucial to the order's wealth and stability as winning any single skirmish. This scholarly training was never seen as separate from their martial duties. It was the other half of the same whole. The mind that could patiently copy a religious text was the same mind that could patiently plan a multi-pronged assault. The man who could calculate the dimensions of a siege engine could also calculate the odds of a successful cavalry charge. Their intellectual foundation did not make them weaker warriors. It made them unparalleled commanders, administrators, and diplomats. In the Templar world, the library was every bit as important as the training yard, and the pen truly was forged into a weapon as mighty as the sword. Their linguistic training began with the foundational grammar of Latin, but it did not end there. A Templar's ear had to be tuned to the bustling markets of Acre, just as well as to the silent prayers of the chapel. The next layer of their education involved mastering the living, breathing vernacular tongues of the Mediterranean world. Old French was the operational language of their own order, and the Crusader nobility, the daily speech of command and camaraderie. But true power lay in understanding the languages of others. novices destined for service in the East were drilled in Arabic and Greek, the twin pillars of commerce and culture in the Levant. This was not an academic exercise in translation. It was a practical tool for survival and expansion. A Templar knight who could converse with a local merchant in his own dialect could secure a better price for grain, discern the mood of a city from its gossip, or overhear a vital piece of information in a crowded tavern that a monolingual soldier would miss completely. Language became their most subtle and effective weapon. In diplomatic negotiations with Muslim rulers, a brother who spoke Arabic could bypass interpreters, building a sliver of trust and understanding that often meant the difference between a lasting truce and a sudden ambush. He could read the subtle inflections and formal courtesies that revealed an opponent's true intentions, turning a simple conversation into an intelligence-gathering mission. This linguistic flexibility made the Templars indispensable as intermediaries. Popes and kings relied on them not just for their military strength, but for their ability to navigate the complex political landscapes where no other European could speak the language. Their command of Greek opened the doors to the Byzantine Empire, a wealthy and often antagonistic Christian power. Being able to negotiate directly with Byzantine officials for safe passage, supplies, or alliances gave the order a tremendous strategic advantage over other Crusader factions. This skill set extended directly into their vast commercial enterprises. A Templar banker in charge of a letter of credit needed to understand the contractual nuances in a local dialect. A shipmaster overseeing the transport of wool from England to Cyprus had to be able to converse with Greek and Italian sailors. Their entire financial network, the engine of their wealth, was lubricated by polyglot brothers who could move seamlessly between cultures. The ability to speak the enemy's tongue was indeed a profound form of strategic penetration. It allowed them to see the world through their adversary's eyes, to understand his fears and his desires. A sword could conquer land, but a shared word could sometimes conquer a situation. This mastery of language transformed these warrior monks into something far more potent. They became shadow diplomats, silent spies, and global merchants, their influence echoing in every market and every throne room they could understand. The same hands that carefully copied religious texts also traced the secret paths of the desert. Within the Scriptorium, the creation of a map was a sacred and strategic act. These were not simple drawings for travelers. They were dynamic intelligence tools, living documents that charted the lifeblood of the Holy Land. Scribes, working from the verbal reports of returning scouts and undercover agents, would meticulously mark the location of a new Saracen watchtower, note a seasonal well that only local Bedouins knew about, or document the shifting alliances of a distant emir. Every line of ink represented a potential advantage or a hidden danger. A caravan route sketched across parchment was not just a trade path, it was a potential ambush site or a vital supply line to be secured. A detailed drawing of a mountain pass included notations on its width, showing how many knights could ride abreast and where the terrain was most vulnerable. This constant flow of information transformed the quiet Scriptorium into a bustling, if silent, war room. The scribes were not merely clerks, they were intelligence analysts, cross-referencing new reports with old maps to create a constantly evolving picture of the battlefield. When a commander in Jerusalem unrolled one of these maps, he was not looking at a static piece of art. He was looking at the accumulated knowledge of his entire order, a crystallized understanding of the enemy's territory. This systematic gathering of knowledge gave the Templars an almost prophetic ability. They could anticipate where an enemy army would need to stop for water, allowing them to position their own forces accordingly. They could identify the weakest point in a fortress wall based on its construction and the surrounding land. The act of copying these updated maps and intelligence summaries was a mission of critical importance. A single sheet of vellum, carefully packed in a courier's satchel, would travel from the Scriptorium in Acre to a preceptory in France, carrying with it the latest strategic landscape. This ensured that a Templar commander newly arrived from Europe was not operating with outdated information. He was already equipped with the most current intelligence from the front lines. The parchment was indeed their first line of defense, a shield made of knowledge that protected them long before a single sword was drawn. From these quiet halls, amidst the smell of ink and parchment, emerged the detailed campaigns that would dictate the movements of armies and shape the fate of entire kingdoms. A commandery's granary held lessons as vital as its training yard. The Templars understood that a knight who could not manage a harvest would soon command an army with empty stomachs. This is why their education extended deep into the complex world of finance and estate management, transforming these warrior monks into some of the most sophisticated economic minds of the medieval world. Novices destined for leadership received comprehensive instruction in the principles of accounting and resource allocation. Their classroom was the commandery itself, a bustling economic hub. A young brother might be tasked with tracking the yield from the order's vast farmlands, calculating the exact amount of wool produced by their massive sheep flocks, or auditing the expenses of the local blacksmith. These were not abstract numbers on a ledger, they were the lifeblood of the entire operation. He learned that every bushel of wheat sold, every bolt of cloth traded, represented future swords, horses, and fortifications for the war in the East. This hands-on training in agricultural management was a masterclass in practical economics. He had to understand crop rotation to maintain soil fertility, oversee the breeding and health of livestock, and manage the labor of lay brothers and local workers. Managing a Templar estate was like running a small, self-sufficient corporation dedicated to funding a holy war. The most revolutionary aspect of their training, however, was in banking. The Order's vast network of commanderies functioned as the first true international bank. A novice would be taught the intricacies of their famous letter of credit system. A pilgrim or noble traveling from London to Jerusalem could deposit his funds at the temple in London and receive a coded letter. Upon presenting this letter at the temple in Acre, he could withdraw the equivalent amount in local currency, minus a fee. This eliminated the extreme danger of carrying coin over long distances. For the Templars, it was a genius system that created a constant, secure flow of capital across continents. The brothers learned to authenticate these documents, manage the complex accounts, and ensure the system's legendary integrity. This financial network became the invisible skeleton of their power, generating immense wealth that funded not only their own military campaigns but also loans to kings and popes, giving them political influence that rivaled their martial strength. Understanding cash flow was indeed a strategic skill as important as siegecraft. A commander who misallocated funds could bankrupt a campaign before a single arrow was fired. Their financial acumen built an economic empire so resilient that it allowed them to project power across thousands of miles for nearly 2 centuries. In the end, their mastery of money proved to be a weapon that fortified their castles, paid their troops, and secured their legacy long after the battlefield fell silent. The roar of the smithy was a different kind of prayer. Inside the forge, a novice learned the language of fire and iron, his hands blackened with soot as he worked the bellows. This was not a punishment but a core part of his transformation. Every Templar commandery functioned as a self-sufficient village, and every knight, regardless of his noble birth, was expected to master the essential crafts that kept their world turning. Their training involved a mandatory rotation through the workshops that formed the beating heart of their community. A brother would spend weeks in the blacksmith's domain, learning to judge the color of heated metal and to shape a simple nail or a horseshoe. He then moved to the armorer's shop, where the clatter of hammers on mail was a constant symphony. Here, he was taught the painstaking process of repairing a hauberk, carefully riveting closed a torn link in his own chainmail. This was not a task to be delegated, it was a personal duty. A single weak link could mean a fatal thrust in battle, so the act of maintenance was a lesson in vigilance and personal responsibility. The stables were another critical classroom. A Templar's warhorse was his most valuable companion, and knowing how to properly shoe the massive destrier, care for its hooves, and treat common ailments was non-negotiable. This fostered a profound bond between knight and steed, a partnership built on mutual dependence. Finally, time in the infirmary taught him the basics of battlefield medicine. He learned to clean and dress wounds, set broken bones, and brew herbal remedies to fight infection. These were not secondary chores, they were vital survival skills. A knight who could not repair his own gear, tend to his horse, or staunch a brother's bleeding was a liability in the harsh realities of a campaign far from home. This hands-on education in the crafts bred a deep and practical respect for equipment and fostered an unparalleled self-reliance. It ensured that every single knight, from the lowest sergeant to the highest marshal, understood the immense logistical effort required to keep a fighting force operational. This knowledge made the entire order more resilient, drastically reducing their dependence on external artisans and suppliers. In the Templar worldview, the ability to create, to mend, and to heal was valued just as highly as the ability to fight. The hammer that shaped the sword was as important as the sword itself. This holistic approach did not produce mere soldiers. It forged craftsmen and healers who also happened to be among the most disciplined warriors on earth. The true strength of a Templar was found not only in his skill with a blade, but in his capacity to build and sustain the very world he was sworn to defend. The packed earth of the training yard was only one kind of proving ground. Inside the chapter house or under the shade of a cloister, a more cerebral form of combat unfolded. Commanders would gather their novices around a large table spread with sand or a cleared patch of ground, transforming it into a miniature theater of war. This was the tactical tabletop, a primitive but brilliant system of war games that taught strategy long before a sword was ever drawn. Stones of different sizes and colors represented units of knights and sergeants, while sticks laid end to end marked the boundaries of forests or rivers. A commander's first lesson was to see the world in this abstract way, to translate a living, breathing landscape into a set of simple symbols he could manipulate and master. The senior knight, acting as the enemy commander, would arrange his stones into a formidable defensive line. The novice's task was to study this arrangement and devise an attack. A direct charge would be met with a devastating counter, the stones swept aside to demonstrate the annihilation of his forces. He was forced to think beyond the initial clash, to consider the second and third moves. How could he use the terrain to his advantage? Could he send a small force of cavalry, represented by a handful of pebbles, on a wide arc to strike the enemy's vulnerable rear? This was how they learned the principle of the flanking maneuver, not through a dry lecture, but through the immediate, visual consequence of their own poor decisions played out in sand. Another crucial lesson was the feigned retreat, a tactic requiring immense discipline. The master would demonstrate how a seemingly broken line could lure a pursuing enemy into a carefully prepared trap, where fresh reserves waited to envelop them. The novices learned to control their impulse for a headlong pursuit, to recognize the difference between a genuine rout and a strategic withdrawal. These simulations drilled the concept of unit cohesion relentlessly. A single stone moving out of formation, representing a knight breaking rank for personal glory, would cause the entire line to collapse. They learned that their strength was geometric, a wall of shields and lances that had to move and breathe as one entity. Most importantly, these sand tables taught the effective use of combined arms. The slow, steady advance of infantry, represented by larger stones, had to be perfectly timed with the hammer blow of the cavalry, the smaller, faster pebbles. A charge that came too early would be isolated and cut down. One that came too late would miss its opportunity entirely. Every failed simulation was a lesson paid for in shame and correction, not blood. These mental duels were a safe laboratory for failure, a place where a future commander could lose 100 imaginary battles in an afternoon so that he might win the one that truly mattered. The chaos of real combat demanded a mind already accustomed to thinking several moves ahead, a skill forged not in the heat of battle, but in the cool, calculating quiet of the sandbox. This inner fortitude was the core of their training, a spiritual armory built to withstand pressures that would shatter ordinary soldiers. While other knights trained their bodies, the Templars systematically fortified their minds, treating psychological resilience as a martial discipline in its own right. Their regimen was a relentless assault on human weakness, designed to forge a state of mental clarity and absolute conviction. Prolonged prayer sessions, sometimes lasting for hours, were not merely acts of devotion but intense exercises in concentration and emotional control. A knight learned to kneel in full armor, his mind focused entirely on his faith, ignoring the physical discomfort, the fatigue, the creeping doubts. Fasting pushed this conditioning further, teaching him to master his most basic instincts, to function with lethal efficiency even when his body was deprived. This constant exposure to controlled hardship created a profound desensitization to suffering, both his own and that of his enemies. The goal was to strip away the fear of death itself, replacing it with an unwavering belief in a heavenly reward for their sacrifice. This was not blind fanaticism, but a calculated and cultivated state of mind. Their absolute faith became a weapon, a form of psychological warfare that they carried onto the battlefield. Imagine the terror of facing a line of these warrior monks, advancing in perfect, eerie silence. They did not scream war cries to inflame their own courage. Their silence was a statement of supreme confidence. They moved with the grim inevitability of a force of nature, each man utterly convinced of his divine purpose and protected by God's own hand. This terrifying image was meticulously crafted to break an opponent's will long before the first lance was lowered. An enemy soldier, seeing their unnerving discipline and conviction, would begin to doubt his own cause, his own strength, even his own gods. The Templars' greatest shield was this invisible armor of belief, a mental fortress that rendered them immune to the despair and chaos of combat. How do you defeat an army that does not fear you, because it does not even fear death? Their training answered that question by making the mind itself an unassailable citadel, proving that the most powerful weapon a knight could wield was an unbreakable spirit. A knight who mastered the sands of Acre could find himself reassigned to the misty highlands of Scotland without a moment's notice. This constant, deliberate rotation was the final and most sophisticated layer of Templar training. The order did not just operate in different regions, it functioned as a single, living organism connected by the steady flow of its personnel. A promising sergeant who demonstrated sharp tactical insight in Portugal would be selected for an exchange program, sent to serve for a year or more at a preceptory in the bustling port city of Marseille. There, he would absorb an entirely new set of military realities. He learned how the coastal commanderies focused on naval logistics and defense against pirate raids, skills utterly different from the large-scale cavalry drills of the inland plains. He studied the unique architectural defenses of a seaside fortress, noting how the gatehouses and walls were designed to resist attacks from the sea as well as the land. This was not a passive observation, it was an active, immersive education, the knight became a student of the world, and the world was his classroom. In the Holy Land, a commander from England would find himself facing the fast, mobile warfare of the Saracen armies. The lessons he had learned about holding a shield wall in Europe were of little use here. Instead, he had to adapt, learning to fight in loose, responsive formations, to use the desert itself as a weapon, and to understand the complex politics of local tribal alliances. When this same commander was later rotated back to a commandery in France, he brought that hard-won desert knowledge with him. He could now train his European brothers in countering swift, light cavalry, applying strategies perfected in the Judean hills to a potential conflict in the French countryside. This systematic cross-pollination of experience meant the Templars never grew stagnant. Their strategic doctrine was a living document, constantly edited and updated by the men who moved through its chapters. A tactical innovation discovered in a skirmish on Cyprus could be tested in a training exercise in Germany within a year, refined, and then formalized into their core teachings. This mobility forged an officer corps with a truly global perspective on warfare. These men thought in terms of continents, not just parishes. They understood that a threat to a supply line in Italy could destabilize a campaign in Anatolia, and that a trade agreement negotiated in London could fund the construction of a new castle on the Syrian frontier. This interconnected awareness, born from a life of constant travel and reassignment, made the Templars the first truly multinational corporation of war, their strength drawn not from one kingdom, but from the collective intelligence of the entire known world. Theoretical wargames gave way to the deafening crash of timber and stone. A commandery's outer fields were often transformed into a sprawling, noisy laboratory for the science of destruction. Here, novices received a brutal education in military engineering, learning to both build and break the strongest fortifications of their age. Their instructors first taught them the terrifying mechanics of the trebuchet, the ultimate expression of medieval physics. A team of brothers would work for days, constructing the massive wooden frame and carefully balancing the colossal counterweight. The lesson was not just in assembly, but in precision calculation. They learned to adjust the weight of the projectile, the length of the throwing arm, and the tension in the sling to achieve the desired range and impact. A stone launched with perfect geometry could punch through a fortress wall, while a poorly calibrated machine would waste its energy harmlessly in the dirt. Alongside these giants, they practiced with smaller, faster engines like the mangonel, understanding its use for flinging burning pitch over parapets to sow chaos among defenders. But the most feared tactic was the art of mining. Novices were taught to dig narrow, timber-shored tunnels beneath a castle's foundations, a claustrophobic and perilous task. The final, explosive act was to set a fire in the mine's chamber, burning away the supporting timbers and collapsing the wall above in a cloud of dust and rubble. This was engineering as a form of targeted demolition, a patient, underground war waged with pickaxes and fire. Yet the success of any siege depended far more on organization than on artillery. A commander's true test was managing the sprawling, temporary city that grew outside the castle walls. Thousands of men and animals required a constant, staggering supply of food and fresh water. Novices were drilled in the complex arithmetic of consumption, learning to calculate how many tons of grain and hundreds of gallons of water were needed daily to sustain the army. A miscalculation meant starvation, mutiny, and a failed campaign. They learned to lay out the siege camp itself with the precision of a town planner, placing latrines downstream from water sources to prevent the outbreaks of dysentery that could decimate an army more effectively than any enemy sortie. Supply lines were the fragile threads connecting this effort to the outside world. and protecting the wagons that trundled along these routes was a strategic priority equal to any assault. A broken axle or a successful enemy raid on a supply convoy could bring a months-long investment to a sudden, humiliating end. This holistic training transformed the Templars into complete masters of positional warfare. They understood that a fortress fell not from a single, glorious charge, but from the slow, inexorable pressure of applied mathematics and meticulous management. The true siege engine was not the trebuchet, but the entire camp itself, a living machine where every loaf of bread and every bucket of water was a component in the final, crushing victory. The open sea presented a battlefield with no fixed lines and no solid ground. While the image of the mounted knight is iconic, the Templars understood that their survival depended on mastering the waves as completely as the land. Their strategic schools extended beyond the commandery walls to the bustling ports under their control, with La Rochelle in France standing as their premier naval academy. Here, amidst the salt air and the cries of gulls, a different kind of Templar was forged. Brothers who had trained for years in cavalry charges now had to learn the language of the sea. They were taught the fundamentals of ship handling, how to read the wind and currents to navigate a heavy transport vessel, and how to manage a crew of seasoned sailors who were not bound by monastic vows. This was not a secondary skill, it was a vital component of their global reach. The most complex operation they trained for was the Amphibious landing, a logistical nightmare that required perfect coordination. Imagine the challenge of moving a unit of fully armored knights from a rocking ship onto a hostile shore. They practiced loading and unloading their most valuable assets, their massive war horses, using special slings and ramps, a delicate procedure where a single misstep could mean the loss of a priceless animal and the knight it carried. This capability was the lifeline of their overseas empire. Without control of the sea lanes, their fortresses in the Holy Land would have been isolated and starved into submission. Their fleets allowed them to rapidly reinforce besieged cities like Acre or Tyre, shocking their enemies with the sudden appearance of fresh troops from over the horizon. But their naval power was not purely defensive. Templar ships conducted daring raids along enemy coastlines, striking supply depots and disrupting Muslim trade routes, applying economic pressure that complemented their land campaigns. They also served as the guardians of their own commercial armada, the floating treasury that funded their wars. A Templar galley escorting a cargo ship laden with English wool or Cypriot wine was protecting the very essence of their financial power. This mastery of the maritime domain meant a Templar commander had to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously. He had to calculate the timing of a cavalry charge based on the sailing schedule of a transport fleet. He had to understand that a storm in the Mediterranean could delay the pay for his soldiers, just as an enemy ambush could. Their education was now complete, spanning from the silent cloister to the rolling deck, making them a truly multi-domain force centuries before the concept existed. Their power did not end at the water's edge, it reached across the ocean. Silence could be a more powerful weapon than any sword. In the shadowy corridors of power, the Templars mastered the delicate art of the interview, a formal term for their sophisticated methods of interrogation. This training was not about crude torture, it was a cerebral duel, a battle of wits fought with words and a deep understanding of human nature. Novices were taught that every person, from a captured soldier to a local merchant, held a piece of a puzzle, and their job was to gently, methodically fit those pieces together. The first lesson was always patience and observation. A skilled interrogator would study a subject for hours before a single question was asked, noting his posture, the flicker in his eyes, the nervous tremor in his hands. They learned to establish a baseline of normal behavior, so any deviation under pressure became a glaring signal of deception. The environment itself was a tool. A prisoner might be brought into a clean, well-lit room and offered food and water, a disarming act of kindness designed to lower his defenses and create a bond of dependency with his captor. The questioning would begin with mundane, non-threatening topics, lulling the subject into a false sense of security before gradually circling toward the critical information. The goal was to make the subject want to talk, to see the interrogator not as an enemy but as a listener. They were trained in the power of silence, to ask a pointed question and then wait, letting the weight of the quiet press down on the prisoner until he felt compelled to fill it, often revealing more than he intended. This psychological approach was often far more effective than any threat, extracting vital intelligence about enemy troop movements, supply lines, and political alliances that shaped the fate of entire campaigns. But knowing how to extract secrets was only half the battle. They also had to become experts in guarding their own. Counterintelligence was drilled into them with the same rigor as their combat drills. Every Templar was taught to be perpetually vigilant, to view every stranger, every new recruit, and even every local tradesman with a measure of healthy suspicion. They learned the subtle signs of a potential spy, a person who asked too many specific questions about supply routes, or who seemed unusually interested in the comings and goings of high-ranking officials. Within their own ranks, they fostered a culture of absolute secrecy. Sensitive information was shared on a strict need-to-know basis, and any brother caught gossiping or boasting about future missions faced severe punishment. They developed secure communication protocols, using complex ciphers for written messages and coded phrases for verbal exchanges. A seemingly innocent comment about the weather, spoken to a courier in a crowded inn, could be a pre-arranged signal to abort a planned movement or initiate a covert meeting. This constant, invisible war of information was fought in every tavern, every market square, and every royal court they entered. Their ability to penetrate an enemy's plans while wrapping their own in a shroud of mystery gave them a decisive edge. In the grand Game of Thrones, where a single whispered secret could topple a kingdom, the Templars understood that the most valuable currency was not gold or land, but knowledge itself. The deserts of the Holy Land taught the Templars their most humbling lessons. Confronted by the swift Saracen horsemen, the European model of warfare, built around the decisive charge of heavily armored knights, proved dangerously inadequate. A wall of steel was useless against an enemy that refused to stand and fight. From this harsh reality, the Templars did something extraordinary. They learned from their foes. They began to absorb and integrate Eastern military doctrine, creating a revolutionary hybrid style of combat. The core of this new approach was a radical shift toward mobility. They saw the devastating effectiveness of the fast-moving, lightly armored horse archers who could unleash a storm of arrows while staying just out of reach. In response, the Templars adapted their own training. While they never abandoned their heavy cavalry, they placed a new, critical emphasis on speed and skirmishing. They drilled in rapid maneuvers, learning to strike quickly and disengage before a slower enemy could rally. This new flexibility demanded a different kind of soldier, leading to their heavy reliance on Turcopole auxiliaries. These were local Christian light cavalrymen, often of mixed parentage, who were masters of the very hit-and-run tactics the Templars needed to master. Fighting alongside these warriors, the Templar Knights gained a first-hand education in Eastern methods. They learned to appreciate the strategic genius of the feigned retreat, a tactic they had once dismissed as dishonorable. Now they saw its brutal efficiency, a carefully orchestrated withdrawal that could lure a proud European army into a deadly ambush in a narrow pass or a dry riverbed. They adopted the constant harassment of enemy supply lines, understanding that starving a fortress into submission was often wiser than assaulting its walls. This was not a betrayal of their Western roots, but a pragmatic synthesis. The Templar who knelt in prayer at dawn could now command a mixed force of heavy knights and agile Turcopoles by noon, using feints and flanking movements that would have been alien to his counterparts in France. Their strategy became a fluid blend of Eastern guile and Western shock power. This hard-won adaptability, forged in the crucible of cultural exchange, became the ultimate proof of their advanced training. They were no longer just European knights fighting in a foreign land. They had evolved into something entirely new, a truly transnational force shaped by the relentless demands of survival. The final step in forging a Templar was not physical but psychological. In the profound silence of a commandery chapel, lit only by a few flickering candles, a novice would kneel before the assembled brotherhood. This initiation ceremony was a meticulously staged drama of death and rebirth, a ritual designed to shatter his old self and permanently weld his identity to the order. The vows he recited were not simple promises, they were sacred contracts spoken in a hushed, reverent tone. With each utterance of poverty, chastity, and obedience, he was publicly severing his ties to the outside world, renouncing personal wealth, family, and his own free will. The setting itself amplified the gravity of the moment, the shadowy figures of his future brothers watching his every word, their presence a tangible representation of the collective he was joining. This was not a celebration, it was a solemn transaction where a man offered his entire life in exchange for a new one. The intense emotional weight of the ritual, the fear, the awe, and the profound sense of commitment acted as a powerful psychological anchor. It created a core memory so vivid and charged that in moments of future doubt or extreme danger on the battlefield, he could return to that moment in the chapel and remember exactly who he was and what he had sworn to become. This rite of passage was the ultimate tool for identity engineering, systematically dismantling the individual and reconstructing him as a single, loyal cell in the corporate body of the Templars. The secrecy surrounding the specific words and gestures of the oath further cemented this transformation. Being privy to secrets that could mean death if revealed created an immediate and powerful in-group mentality. The newly initiated brother now shared a hidden knowledge with every other Templar across the globe, a bond that transcended language and nationality. This shared secret was a social glue, fostering a unit cohesion that was nearly impossible to break. A man would rather die than betray brothers who had undergone the same sacred, secret ordeal. This psychological bond, forged in the dim candlelight of the chapel, was the invisible fortress that held the entire Templar system together, making their loyalty as unbreakable as their famed discipline. That final, unbreakable loyalty became their undoing. On Friday, October 13, 1307, the meticulously constructed world of the Templars collapsed in a single, coordinated blow. King Philip IV of France, desperate to erase his massive debts to the order, launched a surprise dawn raid, arresting every Templar his agents could find on French soil. This was not a simple military defeat, it was a systematic annihilation of an entire intellectual ecosystem. The commanderies were not just occupied, they were looted and sealed. The training yards fell silent, not from a lack of will to fight, but because the masters and students were now in chains. The libraries and scriptoriums, the repositories of centuries of accumulated wisdom, were stripped bare, their contents burned as evidence of heresy or simply lost to the chaotic greed of royal officials. The educational machine that had produced the most disciplined warriors in Christendom was not merely paused, it was dismantled bolt by bolt. The true casualty was not the individual knights, but the living knowledge they embodied. The veteran Magister Militum, who carried the nuanced lessons of 100 battles in his memory, died in a dungeon or at the stake, his expertise extinguished forever. The carefully copied training manuals, the detailed maps, the logistics ledgers, the tactical diagrams drawn in sand, all of it vanished into smoke and ash. This was a targeted attack on memory itself, a deliberate effort to sever the thread of transmission that connected one generation of Templars to the next. The rupture was absolute. The sophisticated doctrines of combined arms, the intricate financial systems, the psychological conditioning, the hard-won adaptations to Eastern warfare, all of these streams of knowledge, once flowing through a continent-spanning network, suddenly ran dry. The lights did indeed go out, plunging a world of strategic thought into a profound darkness. The destruction of the Templar schools created a void in European military education that would take generations to fill, proving that the most devastating weapon is not one that kills soldiers, but one that erases their teachers. The blueprint for the perfect soldier, first drafted in those medieval commanderies, was never truly lost. Its core principles simply found new homes, echoing through the halls of modern military academies like West Point and Sandhurst. The Templar ideal of the scholar warrior, a figure who could debate theology in the morning and lead a cavalry charge in the afternoon, established a template that remains the gold standard for officer training today. Modern cadets undergo a strikingly similar transformation, one that begins not with a sword but with an honor code. This is the direct descendant of the Templar rule, a rigid framework of conduct designed to instill absolute integrity and self-discipline. Just as a novice confessed his faults in the chapter house, a cadet is held accountable by a strict honor system where a single lie can mean expulsion. This foundational emphasis on character is the first and most crucial parallel, forging a leader whose word is his bond. The relentless daily schedule of a cadet, a meticulously planned cycle of physical training, academic lectures, and military drill, is a modern metronome of transformation, mirroring the Templars' seamless shift from chapel to training yard. They learn that true leadership requires a mind as sharp as any weapon. The academic curriculum at a contemporary war college is the evolution of the Templar Scriptorium. Where a knight studied Latin and logistics, a modern officer masters political science and advanced physics. The sand tables used for tactical simulations have been replaced by sophisticated computer war games, but the underlying goal is identical: to teach a commander to think several moves ahead in a complex, dynamic environment. Even the concept of holistic development, the forging of mind, body, and spirit, finds its modern expression in programs for comprehensive soldier fitness and resilience training. The military now scientifically validates what the Templars understood instinctively, that a soldier's psychological fortitude is as critical as his marksmanship. This enduring legacy proves that the Templars were not just warriors, they were visionary educators. Their greatest innovation was not a castle or a battle tactic, but an educational system so robust that its core tenets would guide the training of warriors for 1,000 years. The ghost of the Templar novice does indeed walk the parade grounds of today's academies, a silent testament to a blueprint for leadership that time has never managed to erase. The Hollywood Templar is a thrilling fantasy, a hooded figure leaping across rooftops with a hidden blade, but this popular image obscures a far more substantial reality. These fictional secret assassin cults and occult rituals bear no resemblance to the historical brotherhood. the real Templars were not a band of mystical treasure hunters or practitioners of dark arts. Their training was not designed for stealthy, individual assassinations, but for disciplined, large-scale warfare and complex governance. The myth of elaborate treasure maps, for instance, completely misunderstands their sophisticated banking system. They did not need a cryptic chart to find their wealth. They managed it through a global network of ledgers and letters of credit, a financial reality far more advanced than any fictional pirate's bounty. Their legendary archives contained not magical grimoires, but meticulously kept records of crop yields, shipping manifests, and military intelligence. The initiation ceremonies, while solemn and secret, were not deadly ordeals involving poison and blades. They were rites of religious passage focused on vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, designed to bind a man's identity to the order, not to test his ability to survive a booby-trapped temple. This correction is not about dismissing the legends, but about replacing them with a truth that is, in its own way, even more remarkable. The idea of a lone warrior is exciting, but the reality of a highly organized, multinational corporation of devout soldier scholars is genuinely awe-inspiring. Their power did not come from a magical artifact, but from a revolutionary educational system that produced masters of strategy, finance, and diplomacy. The truth reclaims them from the realm of fantasy and places them firmly in the annals of history, not as sorcerers, but as some of the most effectively trained and organized individuals the world has ever seen. The silence of a ruined commandery speaks volumes to a trained ear. Uncovering the methods of Templar training is a form of intellectual detective work, a forensic reassembly of a lost world from the fragments it left behind. With their central archives destroyed and their history deliberately suppressed, how can we possibly reconstruct their sophisticated curriculum? The answer lies not in a single document, but in a mosaic of clues scattered across disciplines and continents. Archaeologists become the primary investigators, carefully excavating the packed earth of a training yard. The very dimensions of these vast, open spaces tell a story. The consistent, hardened surface reveals the relentless repetition of drills, while post holes suggest the structures for quintaines, the spinning training dummies that taught knights to strike accurately and avoid a counterblow. The layout of a commandery itself, with its deliberate flow from spiritual to martial spaces, is a stone and mortar blueprint of their educational philosophy. Each unearthed horseshoe, each piece of shattered training weapon, is a silent testament to the physical rigor that defined their days. Beyond the ruins, the painstaking analysis of surviving financial records offers a surprisingly vivid window into their daily life. A ledger entry from the Paris Temple might list the purchase of hundreds of practice swords, indicating the scale of their training operations. Another document could detail payments for a master fletcher to teach archery, or for a specific type of feed for the warhorses used in advanced cavalry drills. These dry lists of expenses are transformed into a roster of instructors and a schedule of classes. Even the rule of the order, while primarily a spiritual guide, is read with a detective's eye. Its strict prohibitions against certain behaviors like gambling or boastful talk are not just moral edicts, they are direct insights into the psychological conditioning required to maintain unit cohesion and discipline. Rare mentions in chronicles written by outsiders, often by admiring or fearful observers, provide fleeting glimpses of their methods in action. A passing comment by a visiting bishop about the eerie silence of their training, or a Muslim chronicler's note on their unnerving discipline in battle, adds a crucial piece to the behavioral puzzle. This forensic historical approach is a constant process of cross-referencing. An archaeological find from a commandery in England is compared to a financial record from Italy, and a chronicle from the Holy Land. When these independent lines of evidence point in the same direction, a confident picture begins to emerge. The story of Templar education is not a book we can simply read. It is a shattered vase we must patiently piece together, one ceramic shard and one faded ledger entry at a time. The training grounds of the Templars were not mere fighting pits but the world's first integrated military strategy schools. They achieved what no one had before, weaving monastic discipline, chivalric ethics, deep academic study, and practical engineering into a single, revolutionary system. We have journeyed from the silent Scriptorium where maps were drawn to the noisy forge where swords were mended, from the tactical sand tables to the sprawling siege camps that functioned like temporary cities. This was not a collection of separate skills, but a unified curriculum designed to forge the complete warrior. Their holistic approach created history's most formidable holy warriors by recognizing that true strength is a fusion of a sharp mind, a conditioned body, and an unbreakable spirit. The most effective strategies are never born from brute force alone, but from a deep well of knowledge, discipline, and an unwavering moral compass. The echoes of their innovative methods can still be felt in the honor codes and comprehensive training of modern military academies, a lasting testament to their visionary blueprint for leadership. If this exploration into the origins of strategic thought has captivated you, share your own thoughts on these medieval academies in the comments below, and subscribe to continue unearthing history's deepest secrets with us.